He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
This is Media Watch. I'm Colin Peacock. This week, one of our major newspaper publishers says it plans to close 14 of its local papers in the North Island, possibly by as soon as Christmas. And that could leave some of those towns without local news at all. So what might we miss if they go? But first, an award-winning journalist who was raised on one of those papers went on to dedicate himself to reporting the issue of abuse and neglect in state care. And he was briefly banned from the official apology for that this week. We ask him why and whether he thinks he should have had an apology too.
They've decorated ferries and trains. Survivors of abuse and care carrying thousands of ribbons from around the country to Parliament. They're a powerful representation of those who can't be there for tomorrow's national apology from the government. Kushta Norman has followed the journey.
That was TVNZ's Simon Dallow on One News last Monday, the eve of the official Crown apology in Parliament to survivors and victims of abuse in state care, and also the day it was reported that among those who wouldn't be there was one who'd done the most to bring it to light. Though, as TVNZ's Kushla Norman told Simon Dallow soon after, that changed during Monday.
And a U-turn from the Speaker today. An investigative journalist who was barred can now attend. What's the story there?
The newsroom journalist Aaron Smale, he had his accreditation to cover tomorrow's national apology declined by the Speaker, Jerry Brownlee.
Now, predictably, Parliamentary Press Gallery reporters raised that issue with the Prime Minister at his post-cabinet press conference earlier that day, and the Prime Minister told them he was comfortable with the banning of Aaron Smale.
Well, no, I don't think it's about tough questions. It's actually about some other issues which were raised with the media outlet directly themselves. What we're talking about is, if it was all about tough questions, frankly, none of you would be in this room because you ask tough questions each and every day. So we don't mind about tough questions. It was personally about personal behaviour. But for us, ultimately, whatever the Speaker decides is fine by me.
And there's a bit of an irony there. When the Abuse in State Care report was presented to Parliament back in July, Aaron Smale himself, on this programme, praised the Prime Minister for his thoughtful response to it.
And I take my hat off to him because it was his sincerity in that statement was, hugely important to a lot of people. There will be scepticism in some quarters. They are words at this point, and they need to be backed up with some serious action, and there's a lot to deal with here and a lot of action that needs to be taken. But as a starting point, Mr. Luxon's statement was massive. It seemed to have come with a lot of thought and heart, actually. That was how it struck me.
In the end, Aaron Smale was allowed to be in Parliament to see the Prime Minister and others give their formal apologies. And later, we'll ask if he thinks he's owed one himself. But first, Hayden Donnell looks back at how this unnecessary and untidy affair unfolded and has left many in the media wondering what would prompt ministers to seek to exclude an individual journalist from Parliament and for the Speaker to approve.
Dr. Luxon, can I ask, there's a whole volume on the connection between state welfare homes like Kohitere and Hokio and gangs. Is this going to lead you to rethink your policy on gangs, given that many of gang members are victims?
That's journalist Aaron Smale asking Prime Minister Chris Luxon whether he'll rethink some of his tough-on-crime policies, given the link between people being abused in state care and going on to join gangs. The media conference was being held following the release of the Royal Commission's report on abuse in state care, and Smale was pretty insistent that Luxon addresses questions head-on.
Sorry?
Can you say to the gang members, what would you say to them?
Well, look, I understand many gang members have come from very dysfunctional upbringings. I get that. But also we can't have gang members causing pain and suffering.
You haven't answered my question. Sorry. There's a volume on the connection between welfare homes and gangs. Can you
I've read that.
speak to that?
Yes, I have read that, and I understand that. What I'd say to you is we're making sure we're increasing rehabilitation services in our corrections department, as you saw in the last budget, to actually make sure that people make the change they need to make.
Relatively tough, but nothing worse than what politicians get every week on TVNZ's Q&A, for instance. If they appear on the show, that is. Luxon hasn't in more than a year. Still, Smale's dogged questioning clearly ruffled some feathers in the beehive. On Monday, his employer Newsroom announced that Speaker of the House Jerry Brownlee had barred him from attending the Crown's apology to the victims of abuse in state care. Newsroom said the decision came after government figures complained about those questions to Luxon and others he put to Minister for Children Karen Chow. Smale concedes he pushed that latter run-in a bit far, though it's worth noting Newsroom co-editor Mark Jennings disagreed with that in an interview with News Talk ZB's Heather Duplessis-Allen.
Did Aaron maybe push it a little bit far with Karen Shaw? I haven't heard this, so I'm relying on doing exactly the same thing as Jerry. I'm relying entirely on you here. Did he push it a bit far?
I wouldn't think so. I don't think so, to be honest. Aaron, look, his questioning was quite aggressive and unforgiving. I think there are plenty of ministers that, you know, if it had been Winston or someone like that, they would have just been water off a duck's back.
A day after that interview, Speaker Jerry Brownlee reversed his decision and granted Smale permission to attend the apology, provided he had a chaperone from Newsroom. Whether or not he fell short in his interview etiquette, the decision to bar him in the first place was remarkable. For one thing, it's strange to stop a journalist from attending an event dedicated to holding yourself accountable because he's been too forceful trying to hold you accountable. But more than that, no journalist has covered the abuse and care scandal in more depth and detail than Smale. His work investigating the Crown's failings stretches back nearly a decade. Just last month, Newsroom published his 6-part series headlined Crown Cover-Up. It reveals the Crown's efforts to minimise the legal fallout from the abuse suffered under its watch, detailing how lawyers and government figures tried their best to stop victims taking their cases to court, even when they knew those cases were likely to succeed. One of the people at the centre of those efforts was Una Jargos, who's now the Solicitor General. Smale's reporting wasn't widely picked up by other media outside Newsroom at the time, but there's good reason to believe it was meaningful to abuse survivors. This is the reception they gave Jargos when she stood up to deliver her section of the Crown apology on Tuesday.
As Solicitor General, I am responsible for the way the Crown conducts itself in litigation in court. And I am here today to say that I am sorry for the times that the lawyers have made the terrible situation you were in even worse.
That reception prompted some media figures to revisit Smale's reporting, or in some cases, look it up for the first time. On News Talk ZB, a surprised Nick Mills delivered a broadside to Jargos after the boos prompted him to find out the background story.
Now, you quick Google of her, and the information is just incredible. Once I started reading more about it, I understand why the victims feel that she shouldn't be there anymore.
One News also highlighted the calls for Jargos to step down.
Well, the root of that frustration is that Crown law has its tentacles into every part of the state.
She fought us the whole way, you know. She came up with, you know, every little thing that she could to stop us actually getting any recognition. It was, she just needs to go.
But to those who read Smale's reporting a month ago, few of the facts would have been new. This struggle for cut-through has regularly been an issue. Maybe it's because the accounts Smale reports are so harrowing. Maybe the work of reporting such a grim and huge story is too hard. But few have given this scandal the attention he has over the years. Even this week, survivors worried their stories would again fade from view after the Crown apology was issued, something noted by Catherine Ryan and Bridget Morton on RNZ's 9 to Noon.
And just speaking to one of the survivors last week, the fear is as soon as this is done, the media attention goes, you know, oh, it's done and dusted, the apology's been had.
Yeah, and I think you look at the numbers too that are affected. I think there's about 50% of people are over the age of 50 now. So without being too...
Many are saying, I will be dead before I get my compensation.
Absolutely. So I think that needs to be really taken into effect as well.
Given this, it may have been strange for Smale to finally have his reporting front and centre in the national media's consciousness, only for himself to somehow be at the heart of the story. I asked him for his take on this saga and whether it's brought up some conflicted feelings. Kia ora, Aaron, and welcome to Media Watch.
Kia ora.
So one of your big frustrations over the years has been that there's not enough attention directed at abuse and state care. This week it's finally all over the news, but somehow you're at the centre of the coverage. Did you feel like there was a kind of a bit of irony to that, or was there a sense of frustration?
I mean, frankly, it was just bizarre. You know, it was I didn't even have time to process it, really, because, I mean, I got a ring from Tim Murphy from Newsroom on the Friday, late Friday, and there was sort of indications then that there's going to be a problem here. And then I got sort of confirmation of that I was not going to be permitted to be in Parliament for this event. I was sort of just scratching my head thinking, what is this? It just seemed really, like I say, bizarre. I mean, one, I wanted to be there to do my job for a start, but I also wanted to be there with survivors, many of whom I've, become friends with and I care deeply about. I'm basically kicked to the curb, and it was just like, yeah, it was insulting, but in some respects it was just almost, I don't know, a backhanded compliment or something. And then on the Monday, it all just hit the fan, and not really knowing where it was all going, and being a bit embarrassed because it was, this is the day, most media outlets on a big occasion like this will do previews to try and spotlight what the issue is, and it was a distraction. It was sort of taking away from the actual point of the occasion, which was the apology to victims.
Because you've always wanted to put the spotlight on the victims and call more attention to the victims or survivors and what they've gone through, and then you felt like somehow you had become the centre of the attention.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, before all this blew up, I wrote a piece that was like a preview that ran on the Monday, and I took a bit of a swipe at other media. It's like, well, I've just done this series, none of you have done anything about it. And then, ironically, me being banned, they all piled on and really did go into bat.
You've been frustrated that you're reporting Crown cover-up from a month ago, which details the Crown's efforts to stop victims from taking their cases to court, and that wasn't really picked up.
And if you look at the apology, that issue was kind of stepped around. Mr. Luxon's talked about accountability, but, he's got the person who's the head of Crown Law and his own Attorney General were involved in, one, denying, and two, covering up. Now,
yeah, so what did you make of the back? Because the reasoning behind it was that your behaviour at one presser involving Luxon and another with Karen Chow went a bit far.
Both Tim and Mark and Laura, the political editors, they listened back over those interviews just to say, what is the fuss here? Trying to understand what the allegation was. And I'd given them my version, and I gave them, I think, a pretty frank version, but they actually thought I was overstating my used a tone that was inappropriate, and they said, no, actually you didn't.
I mean, I've listened to the Luxon one. I haven't heard the recording of the one with Karen Chow, but you asked her and David Seymour a question about standing under the insignia of the Māori Battalion, right?
Well,
and that was quite pointed?
It was a tour of this residential where the boot camp thing is going to be held. And there were these photos of the Māori Battalion around, and I could kind of see the logic, okay. And there was this chit-chat between Seymour and some of the staff, and they kept referencing the Māori Battalion. And then I was at the wrong angle to get the photo, but I saw Seymour walk past me, and he goes, I think I'll get a photo of this. And went and stood by the insignia of the Māori Battalion. I've got two uncles that were in C Company. I've interviewed Māori Battalion veterans, and I just had this very visceral kind of reaction. It's like, how dare you tack on the mana of the Māori Battalion onto your policy? Now, my question to them was, do you think it's appropriate to be linking the Māori Battalion? Do you think those men that fought in those battles made those sacrifices so their mokopuna could end up locked up in places like this? It was sharp, my tone was pretty hard. And they didn't really answer that you could tell that they were embarrassed. And then I unpacked a few facts about that. And then from that, I heard then I was reported as some kind of security risk to Luxon's office. I'm the journalist that's been covering it for the longest and knows the most about it. Why didn't they reach out? I press secretaries and political journalists and journalists in general often have a bit of can have a bit of a fractious relationship with press secretaries. That's just part of the job. But there's also a role for them to play in actually, creating channels of communication. And if you haven't got your act together in terms of what you are going to put in front of victims, that's your problem, not mine.
Because Chris Luxon, when quizzed on it this week, he said it was not due to your questions, it was due to your behaviour. Now, you say that you were frustrated at these events.
I've spent 8 years on this.
Yes.
You know, you're going to get, you know, I've been on many occasions horrified at what I have read, what I have heard. When I've tried to get answers, the first story I did, I got lied to by MSD and Crown Law. I asked them about private investigators. Have you used them to dig dirt on victims? No. They'd spent $90,000 on that. And they're trying to somehow put it back on me that, oh, I'm being aggressive, or, oh, I'm doing, what is it? I was doing nothing.
I think that you've said that through this whole saga, you've felt like you've felt like a small part of what the survivors have felt over the years, which is being frustrated by bureaucracy and denied access.
A tiny fraction of a percent, yeah. Māori men, I mean, Māori are the majority here. 80%, you know, of the kids in some of these institutions were Māori. And the biggest, you know, and most of those were boys. So we've got this whole huge number of Māori men out there who've never really had a chance to actually find help, because they've been told, no, you're lying. No, it didn't happen. No. And this is what the Crown's done to them. And then they want to turn around and blame them for being these troublesome, antisocial kind of gang members. It's like, well, what did you expect? The institution that's the, you know, part of the Crown that I've always circled back to is Crown Law. You know, they hold the authority to prosecute crimes, and yet they've been covering them up. And I don't use that phrase lightly. In fact, the Royal Commission uses that phrase.
And when you published these reports a month ago, you were quite frustrated at the lack of wider pickup. Now, after you've been barred from this apology event, it seems like that is getting wider pickup. Is there something gratifying about that? Is it bittersweet?
There is actually, and to be fair, I mean, I know many of the journalists in the gallery, and I don't envy them. They're under the pump the whole time, and it's a management issue rather than one individual journalist. It's a matter of priorities. But I think, and to be fair, I mean, that series was 22,000 words. Who's got time to read that? But now I think it has got pick up, and I was just really, really grateful to, I think it's Jenna Lynch, Kushler at TV1. They really seized on that, and I managed to chip in with some specifics that kept the pressure on, but it was those two and others who really did perform fantastically in their roles, and it was a pleasure to watch. There's an alchemy to it in terms of what gets traction, what gets the headline, what actually gets picked up, where there's a collective it becomes a bigger story than just one journalist's coverage. And I've never really understood or known how that works, because can be so random. I look back in hindsight, and there has been a significant shift. But it's also out there because other journalists are now picking it up, and it's I don't own the story. It's not even a story. It's these people's lives, and they're now getting the sort of attention that they deserved a long time ago, and it's gratifying to have been part of that.
You're going to keep turning up to Parliament to ask the questions?
I don't enjoy press conferences, and I don't really need them to do the kind of work I do. But it just was a bit of a slap in the face. If the government can sort of shut down one journalist because they don't, they're wetting their pants every time that journalist asks a question, then, where does that put the rest of the media? It basically chokes off the sort of coverage that's needed. And that was one of the things that was just so stupid about it. You've basically made an enemy of every other journalist in the press gallery. I wasn't allowed, there were all these conditions put on me. I had to have the chaperone follow me around. I wasn't allowed to take my camera or tripod, so I could only do half my job. I mean, I knew there was people, survivors there, who had 20 or 30 years jail behind them for violence, so they didn't have chaperones. But it was like, what is this? It just seemed a petty way to kind of punish me or something. It's bitten them. It's hurt them more than it ever hurt me. I'll keep turning up, but I've got other work to do as well.
Thanks very much, Aaron. I'll let you get on with it.
Journalist Aaron Smale, who was there in the end at Parliament for the Crown's apology to victims of abuse in state care, an issue he has reported in detail and at length for almost a decade, and he was talking there to Media Watch's Hayden Donnell. And while they were talking there last Thursday, MediaWatch received a leaked email from NZME, the publisher of the New Zealand Herald and many other newspapers in the North Island. And in it, the chief executive Michael Boggs told the staff that NZME now proposes to close 14 of the company's community print publications. So in other words, it wants to kill off most of its free weekly local community newspapers, from the Hauraki Coromandel Post and Katikati Observer up north, down to the Kapiti News just north of Wellington. And some of these papers, like, for example, the Te Aomutu Courier in Waikato, have been in print for more than a century. So, why do they want to do this? Well, Chief Executive Michael Boggs told the staff they have suffered from a decline in advertising revenue and increasing costs to the point where it's no longer profitable. Now, not affected are the company's regional North Island daily papers that have paying subscribers: the Northern Advocate, Whanganui Chronicle, Bay of Plenty Times, Hawke's Bay Today, and the Gisborne Herald and the Rotorua Daily News. But also slated for closure in the North Island under this proposal are the free papers Taupo and Turangi Herald and the Te Puke Times in the Bay of Plenty. In the Hawke's Bay, the Napier Courier, Hastings Leader and Waipukaro-based Central Hawke's Bay Mail might all go as well, along with Stratford Press in Taranaki and the Whanganui Midweek. The Bush Telegraph, based in Pahiatua, could also close, along with the Manawatu Guardian in Palmerston North. Now, the chief executive's announcement was reported on the Herald's website almost immediately in the Media Insider column, which is written by NZME editor-at-large Shane Curry, who also said it's expected that the titles will be closed before Christmas, with just over 30 job losses. And he added,
"In some regions, these titles are the only source of local news, covering their local councils and other public bodies."
Indeed they are, and that's partly because its main newspaper rival Stuff closed down or sold off 28 free community and rural papers back in 2018. And some of the papers that survived that cull were quietly closed later on. For example, the weekly Horowhenua Mail was shut down by Stuff in October 2022. Now, the region did, however, still have the Horowhenua Chronicle, which was established in Levin in 1893, and in its heyday it was a 6 days a week broadsheet newspaper commanding a cover price. But NZME turned it into a free twice-weekly community paper back in 2008, which went on to become 1 day a week on Fridays when COVID struck in 2020, though the Horowhenua Chronicle still had an office, an editor and a reporter in Levin. But now it too is on that list of 14 proposed NZME closures, leaving people in the area without a regular paper, possibly as soon as next month. And that includes investigative reporter Aaron Smale, who we heard from earlier. He lives in Levin, and it turns out Aaron Smale began his career there at the Chronicle. So, last Thursday, Hayden Donnell broke the news of the paper's proposed closure to him and asked what the business of journalism and communities like his own stand to lose if they lose their last local paper.
Yeah, my first full-time job was at the Levin Chronicle, as it was called then. I think I started in 99, so it's like 25 years ago now.
I got my start at the Rodney Times. There's not these pathways through the ranks anymore.
Well, I mean, when I started there was some very, very highly regarded photographers who went on to great things overseas, had got their start at the Levin Chronicle. Kevin Stent, he's been around forever. Great photographer. I mean, that's where he cut his teeth. And there were many other journalists that went through those small newspapers. And to be honest, they were great apprenticeships because you pretty much got all sorts of things chucked at you. I think as the further up the tree you got more specialised and you didn't get to sort of move around as much. But it's certainly in those small dailies, you got so many opportunities. You didn't really realise it at the time, the experience you got. Court reporting, which just virtually doesn't happen. I mean, it was just an obligatory part of the job at that point. Council reporting, I mean, that was one of the rounds I covered. And it just gives you a very solid grounding in basic, journalism. And there were sort of certain things that were a bit of a community kind of butt of jokes, but it was, once it's gone, you don't know what you've lost until it's not there.
I think Gavin Ellis has written about this news desert. It's just places where there's no local news. And you do miss stories, right? Some of the stories that you get, they originate in places that the news media isn't, because we're mainly concentrated in Auckland and Wellington and Christchurch.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's studies done of what this is pretty much a global phenomenon. I mean, just recently I rang up a contact that I got to know in my time at the Chronicle. You know, she still had the goods, you know, she still knew stuff that was valuable. Those long-standing relationships, you might not see somebody for 10, 20 years, but, you know, if you've built that relationship with somebody at some point in your career, you never know when that's going to be of value down the track. And even just the knowledge and the sort of experience that you gain, it puts you in good stead. I mean, you know, I was a photographer as well, and it, you know, you just, again, you had to basically cover everything. If you've got that basic sound apprenticeship behind you, it does carry you a long way. Yeah, there were a whole lot of things going on in council that, you know, are just not going to get picked up now.
That was the Levin-based journalist Aaron Smale there, again, talking to Media Watch's Hayden Donnell. Again, shortly after the news broke that his local paper, where he had his first job in journalism, is one of 14 local papers that the publisher NZME is now proposing to close in the North Island, citing spiking costs of printing and distribution and a slump in income from ads. Coincidentally, this week, NZME also found itself in the news because of another issue that cropped up when one of its former journalists was asked by a listener to her current podcast, whatever happened to her previous one.
What do I want to say about this? See, I very much live my career by, if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all. So I guess I will end up keeping this somewhat brief, and you can read into that what you like.
Well, she ended up saying quite a bit about that, and it raised an interesting question. Who really owns what in digital media these days? And the same question is also at the heart of a new bid to change the law to ensure that we don't break it when we're just trying to make people laugh online.
Excited to get cracking on this work for our artists to bring laws into line with actually what happens out in the real world. Woohoo!
Well, don't woohoo too soon. Changing copyright law is no easy task. Others have tried and failed in the past. And next week here on Media Watch, we'll look at both those stories with an expert on intellectual property and copyright law in the digital media era. Don't miss it. But before we go this week, well, there has been plenty of other big news this week too. On top of the abuse in state care apology, there was the Treaty Principles Bill introduced into Parliament, which ended up being briefly suspended because of Te Pāti Māori's disruption and the ejection of Labour MP Willie Jackson. War broke out in Welly, said Stuff, and it was all grist to the mill for Stuff's 3 News that night.
It was the culmination of one of the fieriest days in Parliament in living memory, with Willie Jackson calling Seymour a liar and Rawiri Waititi saying ACT was running the country like the KKK with a swipe card to the beehive. Meanwhile, thousands continue to march towards Parliament in protest.
And because the bill was tabled sooner than people had planned, it ended up coinciding with the big Hikoi mō Te Tiriti hitting the road both north and south to protest against the bill. Now, that was kicked off fairly quietly last weekend without much media attention, but the symbolic crossing of the Auckland Harbour Bridge on Wednesday did draw the media in droves. And it appeared to be an uplifting outpouring of aroha and kotaitanga on TVNZ's One News at 6 on Wednesday.
Have you got your walking shoes?
Yes, I have.
You can see them from a mile away.
When Mana grows up, I want him to remember that this nation's full of aroha, full of unity, kotahitanga. There's tangata whenua, tangata te tiriti.
But on the same day on News Talk ZB, veteran political reporter Barry Soper told his listeners it seemed to him an unwelcoming and party political provocation.
Because this is being seen as like a rising up of the Māori people, but it's actually not. It's a political party getting people out.
Very much it's the Māori party behind it, and I don't think YTT would disclaim that. But, I got tied up in the hikoi today when I was going on my walk under the Harbour Bridge because they were all gathered there with the Tino Raratanga.
Tino Rangatira flag.
And this probably is a good example of what the question was. I said kia ora to one of them that was walking towards me. He's a man covered in tattoos, head to toe. Look, can you specifically tell me what this protest is all about? And he said, do you speak Māori? And I said, well, as you've just heard.
Clearly not. At all.
And he said, F off, and walked off.
So, different media outlets, different journalists, and very different takes of the same event. I took a look at that in this week's Midweek Media Watch last Wednesday night on Nights with Emile Donovan here on RNZ National, when we also looked at how a second-rank European football match in the Netherlands ended up sparking a diplomatic incident, partly because of the way the media covered the violence surrounding it. If you missed Midweek Media Watch, it's on the Media Watch podcast page of the RNZ website, rnz.co.nz, or our section of RNZ's app, or it's available for free on all the major podcast platforms. That's all from Media Watch for this weekend. Thanks for listening. Hayden will be back with Midweek Media Watch next Wednesday, and then we'll be back again with Media Watch as usual next weekend. Follow Media Watch and listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any podcast app to make sure you don't miss an episode. And if you have any thoughts to share or ideas for us to follow up, do get in touch. Email us, mediawatch@rnz.co.nz, or you'll also find us at MediaWatchNZ on X. And you can even write us an old-fashioned letter and send it to Media Watch, PO Box 123, Wellington. That's all from us for now. Ka kite. Catch you again for Midweek Media Watch next Wednesday.